hey, let's keep talking about this Unit 11 content and discuss extremes and influences of intelligence. So we consider average intelligence to be a 100 when we're looking at a normal distribution curve for things, okay? So a normal intelligence test score is going to be, or an average one I should say, is a 100, okay? So that's what it's going to have when you have a valid intelligence test. It's going to take a look at people then, in terms of those extremes, as one of two groups. Those with what we consider to be an intellectual disability will be at an IQ of 70 or below, and those with exceptionally high intelligence will have an IQ of 130 or above. And so it's important to take a look at those individuals tend to fall very minimally in terms of percentages of the population, okay? The vast majority of individuals are going to fall within a few standard deviations of that average intelligence score. So all that content you learned about with standard deviation back in Unit 1 is going to come back and rear its ugly head for you again. So we define an intellectual disability. It used to be referenced as mental retardation. However, anymore, that term has been so distorted in terms of its popular usage and perception that we just don't use that terminology any longer. These individuals have significantly below average intellectual functioning. So they have to have limitations in at least two areas of what we consider to be adaptive functioning. And so all of those things could be either communication skills, self-care, ability to live independently, social skills, community involvement, self-direction, health and safety, academics, or leisure and work. So if they fall into having two or more of these categories, then they would be labeled as having some aspect of an intellectual disability. There are any number of possible causes for why intellectual disabilities develop. And ultimately, it's a combination of many different factors. You can have aspects of genetics, obviously, when you're looking at a circumstance of someone with Down syndrome, for example. It can be aspects of environmental components, fetal alcohol syndrome, for example. It could be issues of deprivation and neglect. We're going to talk about Jeannie Wiley with one another, and that's a very, very, very significant demonstration of that aspect of things. And in some circumstances, there just isn't an apparent known cause for the possibility of a disability from presenting itself. There's not a cure for intellectual disability, but there are some preventative measures in some types of intellectual disability out there. For example, phenylketonuria. You heard me talk about that when we were covering teratogens in the development unit. So it's possible for a test to be performed that looks for the markers that can indicate PKU, and if it's detected early enough, the mental retardation that can be associated with PKU can actually be prevented if you place the mother on a special diet. So there is the possibility of offsetting that. More generally, though, you could do things like genetic counseling or attain pregnancy care services, and just attempting to educate new parents to ensure that what they're providing to their children in terms of life experiences and in those environmental factors can ensure that intellectual disabilities don't necessarily arise. So when you look at intellectual disability, I'm going to maneuver this here in the middle of things just so that way I'm not blocking any of the words you need to write down for yourself. It's important to recognize that there are multiple different levels of intellectual disability, okay? You can have what we consider to be mild disability, intellectually speaking. So that's an IQ of 50 to 70%. That's about 85% of most intellectual disability cases. So that's the vast majority of individuals that fall into the lower end of standard deviation on intelligence. Academic abilities are in this area at around a sixth grader's level. Okay, they can learn to live on their own and hold a job. So those are certainly things to keep in mind. Then you have moderate intellectual disability, which is an IQ of 35 to 49. Their academic abilities go to about a second graders. Okay, they can be trained in self-care. They can get some aspects of reading and writing skills, but they do need some semblance of supervision. Severe is considered to be an IQ of 20 to 34. Their capacity is about that of a 5-year-old. So They can learn to talk in the vast majority of cases and perform simple tasks, but they're going to be closely supervised for the rest of their lives. They're not going to be someone who's going to be capable of living on their own. And then you have profound intellectual disability, which is anything below a 20 IQ. Their mental age is less than that of a 3-year-old. They're very limited in their communication capacity. They require constant supervision, and they tend to have, but not always, physical disabilities on top of the mental capacity that they have as well. Now, if we switch to the other end of that spectrum, we've got intellectually gifted. So these are people that have IQ scores above like a 130 or a 135. The most extensive research that's been done on giftedness, comes from Lewis Terman, and his data is going to be kind of the driving force behind much of what we know about the concept of giftedness. He took a look at over 1,500 students that were near the top of their IQ range into adulthood. And he found that the gifted kids excelled particularly in school, but had also overall really good health, and they were generally pretty happy. On top of this, newer research takes a look at the fact that highly gifted kids may be susceptible, though, to certain physical or psychological disorders. For example, anxiety and or depression, especially anxiety. If you look at those highly gifted individuals, many of them hold themselves to insanely high standards academically. They expect, for all intents and purposes, perfection out of themselves. And when that is not necessarily attainable in certain situations, because there is no such thing as perfect, that can be very overwhelming for an individual who has, up to that point, been very, 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 very able to maneuver through the realities of scholastic endeavors, for example, and then once presented with things that kind of throw them from that or keep them from that perfection, it throws them for a loop and they just don't know how to handle it. Most are going to continue on a path of success, but for the most part, they led fairly ordinary lives. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be striving to be like president of the United States or like these massive individuals at the forefront of all of these crazy kinds of areas of research and things along those lines. They can be regular, everyday Joe Schmoes, just like you and I, who are not intellectually gifted. So then when we get to this whole issue of intelligence, there is no greater passionately debated aspect within the field to this whole thing than nature versus nurture. Is your intelligence because of your genetics, or is it because of your environment? So we got to take a look at that whole issue, right? Studies of twins, especially identical twins, but not always, studies of family members, even of adopted kids, support the idea that there's a significantly heritable component to intelligence. So by that, what we mean is our differences, to go back to that whole heritability component, our differences genetically, our differences within all of us and our presentation of our IQ is highly heritable. So it's due to genetics, okay? There is a lower correlation of, issues of intelligence for identical twins that are raised together. So that kind of shows a little bit aspects of the environmental impact over those that are raised apart. So there's very much an aspect that connects here that your intelligence has a highly heritable, highly genetic component to it. And a lot of that comes from the research that was done by James Bouchard with those Minnesota twin research projects that were done. He found lots of different pairs of twins who were identical, who were raised in separate environments. You remember the Jim and Jim gentlemen that we took a look at back in our earlier units. The research is still very much ongoing. There is a lot of power behind the issue of genetic influence. Remember, there's tons of stuff that has this creepy context of thinking that it would be environmental components that would explain why things are the way they are, but in fact, it turns out to be a genetically inherited component. But it's important to take a look at that when you look at things within these twin studies, they had very similar results in terms of personality, temperament, and intelligence. They were just very, very, very similar. It's also important to take a look at some other research that looks at this genetic influence. For example, there's stronger correlation in IQ scores with identical twins when you compare them with fraternal twins. It's not a perfect positive correlation, excuse me, but it's still pretty noticeable. Adopted kids do tend to have a more similar IQ to their biological parents rather than the adoptive one, which isn't to negate the impact of an adoptive parent. We'll talk about that in a second with the environmental components. And research that came out of the Human Genome Project takes a look at the fact that science can see a very highly genetic basis to intelligence because it involves multiple interactions of many different genes that connect in on things. But as I said, it doesn't negate the significance of environment. Okay, there's greater similarity in IQ scores of individuals reared together than those reared apart. So if you have fraternal twins, for example, who are just like regular everyday siblings, they can have IQ scores that are fairly similar to one another. So that does lend itself towards some importance of the environment that those kids were being raised in. Same goes for identical twins. School is a really important thing too. The more school you have, the higher the intelligence score seems to go. So if you're someone who goes on to master's degree, PhD, doctorate, going into med school or something like that, it does tend to show higher scores in relationship to that. So it's kind of a nice thing to see that there's different scholastic endeavors that are happening in society, like the Head Start program, for example, that try to facilitate learning early on and get kids into school and liking it at an earlier age to offset any possible issues environmentally, like poverty or a lack of access to certain schooling components or technology pieces that would traditionally prevent kids or put people on different playing fields. The reality within this controversy is, they've done studies on different ethnicities, social classes, kids that are adopted, kids that are raised by their biological parents. The reality is this: there's no solid evidence that comes out either way to support nature or nurture. Taking a look at one over the other definitively. When you try to look at the impact of environment on some of this stuff, there is some evidence that says that if you change the environment, it can impact a kid's IQ scores when they were in scenarios of deprivation. You can point to things with Jeannie Wiley, who is called the feral child. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of a video clip or two in class on her, because she's just a fascinating study. Her family life was just awful. She was chained to a toilet for the first 14 years of her life, and so she was completely deprived of any normal social development, any cognitive development in terms of appropriate schooling. And so the research that was done on her, trying to offset the lack of exposure to certain stimuli during those critical periods of her development, are pretty fascinating. Problem is, in her situation in particular, there wasn't much that could be done to offset some of the deficiencies that she had. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in class with one another. Let's talk about another hot button component of intelligence: men versus women. Believe it or not, males and females have the same average overall intelligence. One is not better than the other. They do have differences, typically. We don't want to stereotype, but they do have differences for the most part in specific areas of ability. Girls tend to be better spellers and more verbally fluent. Some would argue because we just talk a ton. They are better at locating objects and detecting emotions, picking up on those kinds of things. Boys do tend to score higher in spatial abilities, which would then lend itself toward understanding why they do tend to also do decently well in mathematical reasoning and problem solving. And interestingly enough, boys outnumber girls at both the high and low extremes of mental abilities, which is kind of an interesting piece to take a look at. Now we got to take a look at this issue of whether intelligence tests are biased. Because when you look at this issue of aptitude tests like SAT, ACT, things along those lines, they're meant to predict how well a test taker is going to perform in a given situation. So with that in mind, then they do have a little bit of a bias because they're sensitive to your performance differences based off of differentiations of education and experience. A kid who recently immigrated from Romania could score lower on the SAT than a kid who was raised in America. And so the question you got to ask yourself in that regard is, should something be done to fix that issue? Many are obviously going to say yes because it's not fair, but then the question is, how do you do that? Like, what do you do to go about attempting to address those changes? In the scientific sense, that a test is attempting to predict less accurately for one group than another, research does show that tests like the SAT and the ACT are unbiased. Its predictive validity, or we've talked about validity and reliability, is roughly the same for men and women, for individuals along lines of race, for blacks and whites, and for socioeconomic status as well, for rich and poor. So those are important components to take a look at too. What is also of significance to note within this realm of attempting to look at components of intelligence is the issue of stereotype threat when looking at tests in particular. This is a self-confirming, excuse me, let's start that over again, stumbling over my words here. This is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So let's go back to that thing that we talked about earlier with the gendered differentiations on intelligence. Men tend to perform better on math, or in math in general, because of that spatial reasoning and the problem-solving components, right? So let's say that you're a girl, okay? You have a concern that because you are a girl, you will perform worse in a math class than a boy because you're a girl. Obviously, then that's going to affect your performance on a number of tests. ACT looks at math, ACT looks at math, and so that's an important thing to recognize, that if, for all intents and purposes, you're doing a self-fulfilling prophecy here. Here's the thing, though. A stereotype threat only becomes an issue if it's been activated in a person. So let's take this example we've just been using here. If I were a math teacher and, you and I were having a conversation or whatever, and I said to you, oh, well, here's the thing, though. Because you're a woman, you tend to not do really well in math and science areas. So I'm not really surprised that you didn't do so well on this Unit 1 test. Well, then when Unit 2 came around, more than likely you're going to be operating under that stereotype threat when you come across some questions that you can't do. Oh, well, I can't do these because I'm a girl and I tend to perform worse in these kinds of areas. Okay, it only became an issue in that circumstance because I activated it in you. Okay, and that's an important piece to recognize for a stereotype threat. It's not just going to automatically be present there for a person in their brain. It had to have been activated in you somewhere along the line. Okay, and so that could ultimately then end up hindering a person's success on some of those components on standardized tests moving forward, which ultimately then ends up impacting things in terms of a bias as well. So this is the end of the extremes of intelligence notes. Let me know if you have any questions.